The views expressed in this podcast belong solely to the NCS Graduate Volunteer Podcast team and or the guests featured in the podcast. Therefore, these views do not represent Learn by Design as a company nor its employees.
Hello everyone, welcome to GradCast. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Cordis Marie and I am your lead host.
Hi everyone, I'm Just Karen.
Hi everyone, I'm Simran.
And hello, I'm Kaya.
We'll be talking about how the Black Lives Movement was a long-awaited call to action that is finally challenging the systemic racism and reinforcing that everyone has the right to live without discrimination.
We will also be talking about where and how this came about, and as well as the inequalities of all people of colour and social classes.
So let's start from the beginning then. Of course, we have had a big thing about BLM for the past few months. But with that, we've had lots of new information about colonization and slavery and how that began. So let's talk about slavery in America first, because I feel like that's very mainstream. That information is known worldwide. It's taught everywhere in schools. So we know that, the slave trade, people were taken from West Africa over to America, to the plantations, to work against their will under disgusting conditions. And we know how that has had implications in the world today, in the Black community. And unfortunately, these implications and these social injustices have been going on throughout time for about 400 years, and they don't seem like they're going to stop. But we have things like BLM, which show hope of things changing. There are so many people who have changed their minds and things like that. So I just want to get an opinion from the rest of you guys. What do you think about the BLM marches and the activists' opinions on BLM?
I think it's a really important movement, and I'm really glad something like this has happened, because I think it's something that's been really long awaited. And I think even though the trigger for this year was George Floyd and his death, I think it's something that should have happened a lot earlier, but because of these marches, a lot more has resurfaced. And I think it's really important that events like this and movements like this keep taking place so that we get to know more about the matter. Just Kieran, what do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Simran. And I think it was definitely something that was coming for a long time. Back in 2013, there was a shooting of another teenager, Trayvon Martin, and I think and even before that, there have been numerous counts of police brutality, especially in America, and it's just been a long time coming, and it was needed for people to wake up about it. What about you, Kaya? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, these protests were a long time coming, and let's just pray that that change will end up happening, because people are finally seeing the injustice that Black people go through every single day.
But we also know that police brutality happens in England as well. We had the riots in 2011 that shaped a lot of people's opinions on police today and how the police have been treating the Black community, and it's brought awareness. And then for the BLM marches to happen all over the world, in so many countries, that has really pushed forward meanings and information about white privilege, discrimination, and so many other institutionalized racism that we almost pushed under the rug for way too long. And I think that it's way too obvious now for us to ignore. So Jazz, could you please give us a definition of what you think white privilege is?
Yeah, definitely. Well, white privilege plays into every caveat of our society in that it operates under the belief that white people are superior because of their race, because of their color, and because of Eurocentric standards that have been present within society for thousands of years. And because white privilege is so completely instilled within our society, that is why it's so hard to eradicate, because race is such a sensitive topic for many people, and many people feel uncomfortable talking about it. But unless white people especially recognize the privilege that they have and they use it to help others, I don't think that we'll be able to cause change without that.
Kaya, do you agree with this opinion?
Yeah, I definitely do, because when white people are said that, oh, you have about white privilege, I don't think people know what that actually means. And so it comes from some white people from working class can say, oh, I don't have white privilege because of my background and how hard it was growing up. But that's not where white privilege comes from. It comes from your skin, and I think that's what we need to get out for people to understand what white privilege really means.
Exactly, and it's really exposed in systemic racism, which is racism on a grand scale in political and societal institutions. And we can see this everywhere in schools, right through hospitals, in universities, in workplaces. We can see this affecting the BAME community so deeply, and that can also be seen in the stats and statistics that we've gotten from the coronavirus, but we'll talk about that a bit later. We mentioned earlier about police brutality and how that's affected us and how we view the police. Do you know anything about police brutality and the kind of protests about that? Anything about ACAB, things like that?
ACAB is a political idea describing the way in which the police justice system is run. Many view the police as corrupt due to the actions of officers within its ranks. This can devalue the lives of at-risk individuals, often those in minority groups and or those who have historically been targets of oppression. ACAB does not mean that individual police officers are at fault. It suggests that the police justice system as a whole is not fit for purpose and promotes a more community-based approach to law enforcement is needed.
Yeah, so I actually only properly got to know about ACAB this year as a result of obviously the protests in America and stuff like that. But I think it's a really important movement just because it stems back to systemic racism, but the fact that we can see it within us in present day just shows how important it is, because we know that Black people are 5 times more likely to be stopped and searched and 5 times more likely to be a victim of police brutality, which shows how much of a problem it is. There's a higher presence of police in Black neighborhoods, and this needs to be questioned. So I think just evidence like that shows how important it is for movements like ACAB to be present in society and show that there are faults in the police system which need to be fixed, in my opinion.
Yeah, exactly. Does anyone else have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was reading an article the other day on the New York Times, and they had pulled up some statistics from a study done back in 2012, and it showed that there were 0.5 white people shot for every million of the population, whereas there were 3.3 Black people shot dead by the police for every million, and that figure has only increased almost exponentially, this many years later. And I think that that's really disheartening for me and for the BAME community in general, to know that even despite all the protests and everything that's been going on, it doesn't seem like the statistics are reflecting what everyone's been trying to prove.
And I find it really interesting that you said that these numbers have only been increasing. You'd think that with all of these movements and all of this information that we're putting out there, that, you know, it would decrease and racism would, you know, slowly cease to exist, but it only seems to, you know, become more evident. And it's scary that we are still living in generations that choose to be ignorant, and choose to completely ignore other races and think that they are superior to one another, when in reality we are all equal and we are made equal or human. But this idea didn't really come about, you know, human rights didn't really come about until the 1960s, and that's an idea that we need to wrap our head around. This has been less than 100 years since that, you know, has occurred. I think it's been around 80 years since we've recognized that all humans are equal, as on a worldwide basis. And this is really surprising to me, because you'd think that this was common knowledge, you know, but, you know, events like slavery, events like, you know, police brutality and all of these things only further implement our distrust in society, and like you know, faith, like our lack of faith in, you know, the people who are meant to protect us. And I think that it's really sad that people have to live this way, especially people of color who are also, you know, human. They're not anything less than that. You know, they're not animals. You know, we're not animals. We should be treated the same way as other people do, white people do. And it's sad that we still have to live in this reality that's so outdated, you know? What do you think, Kaya? What do you think about how slavery and, you know, things of the past have affected today? Do you think that it's been a big effect, or do you think that we've got to move on and move past that?
Yeah, I think we should always look back into history, because history shows us what we don't need to repeat. And unfortunately for like the world, that's obviously not been the case, even though people of color in the BAME community have actually gotten the representation they need. It's not been enough, and the rights that they've gotten, and it just shows that there needs to be a change in like the political institutions. There has to be a change worldwide. There needs to be the education and the teaching on how this is just not right, and that's, in my opinion, that needs to change.
And you talked about discrimination and inequality in general, but can you give us examples of where you see this, or if you've had any experiences yourself? Do you think that you could tell us a few stories?
Well, I'm lucky to not have really experienced anything like, not haven't experienced systemic racism, so I'm quite fortunate in that respect. But I think in like places like schools, racism can be, because it's a form of systemic racism, and it can be that in the playground a child is being picked on because of their colour, and unfortunately I have experienced that, and it just goes to show that the minds of children, no child is born racist, and the things that the parents have been teaching their kids, it just feels as though there won't be a change unless the older generations start realizing that people of colour are just as important and have the same rights as them.
Simran, what about you? Have you experienced anything similar, anything different? Would you like to tell us about it?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I've first-hand experienced racism, luckily, but I've definitely seen it around me. Like, even just like within the neighbourhood, there is often a really clear difference between how white versus black people are treated, or even just the stereotypes associated with black people. It's really sad, and it's really sad it's still like so bad in this like present society. That's why I think it is as much of a problem as it was before, even though maybe it might be more implicit now, I think it's still just as much of a problem. And as Kaya was saying, I think school is a really like good example of like how like racism and maybe discrimination can maybe stem from, because I feel like schools are in a way like a sort of replica of wider society and like the people we choose to like, I mean, the sort of people that we like grow to become in a way. So I definitely think like not even just that, but I think like education, like our curriculum that we're taught in, I definitely think that a lot needs to be done in terms of like Black history, because Black British history is still British history, and I think that we definitely need to learn more about it, because there's so much like all like the compulsory topics that we learn in history, a lot of them are not like related to Black people at all and don't address how brutal like colonialization and imperialism was, for example. So I think things like that are something that are really important when discussing like racism and inequality in general.
You mentioned colonialization. Can you explain what that is, and just really expand on that?
Yeah, colonialization, I would say, is like, I think of the British Empire on first thought, and how the British like invaded and conquered a lot of countries, and so did the Spanish as well. The Spanish Empire was a really big one. So I think more education into that is definitely more important. And as well as in history, I think also in English literature as well, I think a lot can be done in terms of us learning more about Black history from literature. Because I could literally not tell you, I could literally count on my hands how many texts I've learned that were by Black writers in comparison to white ones. And I think it's really easy to adapt the curriculum and make sure that we're all being educated so that inequality can be learned more about and we can all learn about it as people.
Nice. I just want to expand on the colonization period, because it's really affected countries, especially in Africa and Asia, that were colonized and kind of left with nothing. So me being a first generation immigrant, I know that coming into this country was a difficult process. Getting my papers to stay in this country and be, a citizen, it was hard. And then you think about all the implications that are happening now and the process that are happening now with the SARS movement, and things happening in other parts of Africa, like in Congo with the oil. There's so much that is happening right now, and it stems from colonization and colonialization, and how Britain, almost the British Empire, came and took everything and then left us with nothing when we wanted independence, and that has left people with corrupt governments, huge disparities and inequality, and this is not just in Africa, this is in Asia as well. India is, almost on its last legs right now, because so many children are working hours, without reasonable pay. They shouldn't be working regardless, they're children, and this is not just going on in India, it's going on in Bangladesh, it's going on in Indonesia, it's going on in the Philippines, it's going on everywhere, and it seems to be, these third world countries, quote unquote, that are suffering, and, these first world countries like, the US, like Britain, like France, Spain, that are really excelling, and it's off the backs of all of these people who fought for their independence and try to separate themselves to build a new life, but they're constantly being pushed down by their past. Jazz, do you have any information on this, or what do you think about colonialization in general?
Yeah, I think when people think about colonialism, they have this idea of, slaves being brought over like hundreds of years ago, or the warriors, like British warriors, going into these quote unquote third world countries, as you said, and conquering them. But the reality is that colonialism impacts us just as much today as it did back then, because as you mentioned, as first generation immigrants, as children of immigrants, our lives have been shaped in the context of sacrifice, and just as our ancestors experienced all those sacrifices that they had to make to gain their independence, to care for their families, in a similar way, our parents have had to sacrifice their homelands and, the places they called home in order to find a, quote unquote better place for us, because it is reality, like you say, the first world countries do benefit off the back of those that they have colonized. And so as children of immigrants and as a first generation immigrant, I completely recognize how differently our lives could have been if perhaps colonialism didn't take place. And, it hurts me to imagine how those countries could have thrived if that didn't happen to them.
Yeah, and I think that everyone here can, vouch for that, our lives would be so very different had these continents been left alone and left to, we had so many resources. We still have so many resources which are still being exploited. And, we could have seen these continents grow so much more than they have today and excel so much further than they have today, if not for colonization. And, we've had to struggle almost from the very beginning because, everything was stripped away from us so very quickly. And in replace we got guns and violence and disease. It's things like that that really, when you think about it, really hit hard. And it's not talked enough, as Simran said, it's not talked enough about in schools. And it's that kind of subliminal racism that is what we call institutional racism, where it's like pushed under a rug. We don't want to talk about it. We want to forget about our past. We want to move forward with these social disparities in place still and still at work, and we don't want to acknowledge any of these. Kaya, you said something before about society today being so unequal, and how that's affected the BAME community. And we talked earlier about coronavirus. Do you know anything about how the coronavirus has really affected and hit the BAME community?
Yeah, so the BAME community is disproportionately affected by coronavirus than their white counterparts. And this could be due to cramped living, the fact that they have less money and their social class in society. And it just goes to show that coronavirus is showing the injustice that the BAME community is experiencing, and that just shows everyone that something has to be done.
Out of interest, how has everyone been getting along with the virus? Not getting along would be the wrong use of the word, but how has everyone been, over these past few months? How have your lives been? Your school, how has that been? Kai, what about you? What would you like to start?
I guess my life has been it's just school's not been great, and the fact that we had to shut and close schools, and it's just that the handling of the coronavirus, maybe a bit of topic, but it just has not been great. And that's in my opinion. And just showing the news is making it clear to us that people, that especially the BAME community, are losing way too many of their family and their friends. I mean, coronavirus is terrible for everyone, but especially for them. All the nurses that have dedicated their lives to the NHS. I mean, they all the BAME community almost makes up a third of the NHS, and they're not being rewarded for their work, and yeah, it's just wrong. That's my opinion.
Simran, what about you?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think personally, the coronavirus did obviously make a big impact to both my studies and just like my life at home. You know, adjusting to online school has been a challenge, I guess. But I think on a like bigger scale, I think it definitely like revealed a lot of how society works in a way. Like I was quite outraged at the fact that we were clapping every week for nurses on a Thursday, but when it came to raising their wages, everyone seemed to go quiet, you know? I think that's something that I was quite shocked about, especially after hearing recently that MPs are demanding a pay rise even after the people like who are working harder throughout the pandemic, in my opinion, they haven't got a pay rise. I think that's something that I was quite struck by. But yeah, I think the pandemic has been really important in that sort of sense, like revealing how society works and maybe like the flaws in society. I think that's something that the pandemic has definitely highlighted.
Jazz, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what Simran and Kaya were saying. And I suppose I've just taken a bit of the time that we had off to kind of further educate myself because, you know, with everything that was going on, and especially when the marches started and the protests started, you realize that you don't understand as much as you think you do about the history actually of what is causing these protests and just the like Black history as well. Because as you mentioned, Cordis Marie, you know, Black British history isn't mentioned or touched upon as much as American history is. So I would definitely recommend the book, The Good Immigrant. It's a series of essays and, you know, I've gone through it and I've highlighted my favorite ones. And it just provides kind of a series of insights into what it means to be a minority and what it means to be an immigrant, really, because those are defining features of our lives now.
Yeah, you're speaking about amazing books that I've actually read that book. It's so good. There are so many other books out there as well, like Why I Don't Talk to White People About Race Anymore. That's a really, really good book. It's really, really popular, and ever since the BLM protest, you know, boomed, these books about race and inequality have really, really, you know, started selling. Another really good one is White, you know, Privilege and How It's, you know, Broken. I think that's a really good book to read, and I think I'd recommend that, you know, to white people who don't understand yet what white privilege is and, you know, how it affects the BAME community and people of color around them, and how it affects you as well, you know, how it affects, you know, white people differently, because as we mentioned before, white privilege, you know, it's the privilege of skin color. It shouldn't be there, it shouldn't exist, but it does. But unfortunately, you know, different sexual orientations and, you know, other factors may affect how much privilege you have, you know. So that's a really, really good book to get reading. And we've not got a lot of time, but I do want to talk about cultural appropriation, because that's also a very big topic that came up, you know, through the BLM protests. So, Jazz, do you want to explain what cultural appropriation is?
Yeah. So cultural appropriation is when you misuse, you know, someone else's culture, the items in someone else's culture that are held valuable and that are rewarded really for people in those cultures. And it's quite degrading because, you know, the history of someone's culture is very personal to them. It's linked intrinsically to their history, to their parents, to their family ties. And when you see people misusing it, as we have seen numerous times in the media, you know, especially with a lot of influencers that try to sensationalize items, especially in the Black community, that have previously been condemned, like hair. You know, cornrows are used by influencers to become, you know, are popularized, whereas in workplaces they're condemned and they're seen as unprofessional. And there's a huge difference between cultural appropriation and appreciation, which I'm sure Cordis Marie, you can explain that too.
Yes, so cultural appropriation, as Jazz said, is the complete misuse of someone's culture. It is using that culture inappropriately to make money off of it. Whereas cultural appreciation, of course, this is, defined differently by different people. But for me at least, it's, engaging with that community, it's, really appreciating that culture by maybe asking someone, a friend or like a family, or if you go to like an Indian wedding, for example, you would wear, their traditional clothing if they ask you to. It's not, I want to wear it, I'm gonna wear, the wrong thing. I know that there are different dresses and how people dress according to different events and according to different ages and things like that. So you cannot just take that culture out of their hands. They need to be able to really communicate that culture with you, and it's up to the people to decide whether you're appreciating that culture well enough and appreciating that culture in a respectful manner. And I think that Beyonce did that very, very well in her recent documentary and her, I think, musical like videos and everything. She really engaged with these cultures and these African cultures. She engaged with that side of herself, and she didn't just use the money for herself and take all the money and kind of run away with it. She gave back to these communities, and she's continuously helping these communities. And I think that that's an amazing example of what we should be doing in society, instead of, things like Kim Kardashian, which are, who are using cornrows, for example, as Jazz said earlier, to, just sell their products and things like that. It's not, it's rude. As a black person, I know that I've been condemned for my cornrows in schools before. So, just seeing that being completely, accepted and renamed almost in other societies and in Hollywood, it's really affected me and it's really upset me. And I'm sure it's upset so many other people. And we need to understand that cultural appropriation doesn't just happen in the black community. It happens everywhere across all races, and it can happen to anyone. So we're in a society where we have so much information and access to information. So before you step out with your new braids or your new extensions or things like that, your rings, research, where does this come from? Is it appropriate for me to wear it? Ask your friends as well. Don't be ignorant and don't say, I think it's nice, I'm just going to leave it because it doesn't look nice, your hair will fall out, and it's not cute. So let's just take that into consideration before walking out the house, and making yourself look like a fool, but also making a mockery out of other cultures. I just want to touch on diversity and things like colorism in different communities and in media, because I know that in the Asian and black community, lighter skin tones are preferable to darker skin tones. Simran, do you think you can explain this?
Yeah, definitely. I think colorism is such a big problem even to this day, and obviously it stems back to all these Eurocentric standards that can be seen just through colonialization, as we've said. And I saw it like recently in the media actually, where there's this brand called Fair and Lovely, which is obviously a very problematic name because just from the name itself, it's suggesting people should, be bleaching their skin and all these other problematic methods that exist unfortunately in South Asian societies, predominantly, and in black cultures too. And they decided to change their name to Glow and Lovely, which is not much better. I was equally outraged. But I think just things like that show how like prevalent like colorism and discrimination still is, because I have seen it like firsthand, not personally, but I have seen it like when I have gone to other countries, like when I've gone to India actually. I was like constantly seeing how people would always be encouraging people to, you know, use these face masks, it'll make your skin glow, it'll make you fairer. And all these things are so problematic because it sort of like implicitly encourages you to like want to look more Eurocentric rather than embracing who you are. And on top of that, I definitely think the media perpetuates this and makes it even worse. There is definitely a lack of diversity, especially in films and in the media in general. There's definitely a lot less diversity than what we should have, for sure. So I think it was recently Rihanna's Fenty Beauty. They had their fashion show, and that definitely, I think, portrayed diversity a lot better than, you know, other brands. So I think more companies should definitely be taking that sort of stance and making sure that there is more diversity so that all cultures can feel more welcomed, rather than having to feel like they need to, you know, bleach their skin or any other outrageous methods to like not be themselves.
Thank you. And before we wrap up, Kaya, do you have anything to say?
Yeah, just about colorism. So with Rosa Parks, she was not the first Black woman to sit in the wrong place on the bus. It was, in fact, this 15-year-old girl called Claudette Colvin. And the problem with that was she was too dark and she wouldn't be widely accepted with Black and white people. So because Rosa Parks was lighter, and there's a problem with colorism within the Black community, and I think that is a real issue that needs to be resolved.
Yeah, I also think that colorism is a big issue in the Black community, and that's an inner issue that we need to solve together. And that's not going to solve itself. And that example with Rosa Parks, that is one that's often overlooked and misconstrued in the public eye, especially because during that time, the image of Black people, you know, portraying that we are good and human, that was a very, very important image that we needed to portray at the time. And comparing Rosa Parks to the dark-skinned 15-year-old girl, Rosa Parks would have been the quote-unquote best fit to portray our community in the best light. You know, even in movies, you know, that Black people of all skin types can be portrayed as good people. And it's really sad that, you know, when, you know, I'm sure you've seen like movies where it's come from books that portray dark-skinned characters and then end up being light-skinned characters in the actual movie. I've seen many movies in which Black women are misrepresented. And of course, light-skinned mixed-race women, they are also Black, and we see that in the community, and we obviously welcome that. But there is a very, very small group in our community that is being belittled and being shamed for simply the gradient of our skin. And I think that is an issue, as you said, that we need to tackle within ourselves to really portray the message that all Black lives matter. I just want to thank you guys for speaking with me today, and thank you guys for listening to GradCast. It's been, you know, Cordis Marie and everyone else. Just say bye quickly.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. It was lovely talking today.
Thank you so much. It's been GradCast.
Thank you so much for listening today, everyone. If you liked our content today and liked our conversation, please like, share, and subscribe. We'll definitely be posting more, and we'll be very active on all our social media sites. If you'd like us to discuss any other topics that you find interesting, or see us discuss any more current issues, please comment below, and we'll definitely consider them. There are a lot of other prevalent topics that are going on right now that deserve our attention and deserve young people talking about them. So we would love to hear your opinions on them.